This past week, our class conducted a chemical reaction based on combining two reactants, KOH and CuSO4. We then proceeded to observe the precipitate formed and based our limiting reactant off the data we collected.
To further explain, the image provided shows an example of a limiting reactant, as well as a mole ratio. The car bodies and the tires represent the reactants that combine to form the products. In this case, it's the car. There are 8 car bodies and 48 tires, which total to 8 full cars with an excess of 16 tires. As you can see, the car bodies run out first, making the limiting reactant. They control the product amount. The tires are the excess due to the fact that there are still some left over after the reactant.
The balanced equation presented for the lab we performed is 2KOH reacts with CuSO4, which yields with CuOH2, which reacts with K2SO4. 2KOH represents 2 moles of potassium hydroxide, and this reacts with 1 mole of copper sulfate to yield 1 mole of copper hydroxide and 1 mole of potassium sulfate. The mole ratio of this equation is 2 to 1. This ratio is represented between the amounts of reactants to products.
For our lab, we were provided with 2 barrettes filled with 50 milliliters of KOH and 50 milliliters of CuSO4. Along with these, we had 8 separate test tubes that were numbered. 1 graduated cylinder that measured our distilled water. Lastly, we had a glass stirring rod, safety goggles, and gloves.
The first step of our reaction was that we filled each of the 8 test tubes with milliliters of H2O, decreasing by 1 milliliter per test tube, from 7 milliliters all the way to 0. Then we added 5 milliliters of CuSO4 to each test tube, and finally added milliliters of KOH, gradually increasing by 1 milliliter, starting with 1 and ending with 8 milliliters. After combining reactants, we used the glass stirring rod to stir the mixture for 1 minute, then let it set for another 15 minutes in hopes of finding precipitate levels, the solid that formed after the reaction, along with supernatant levels, the liquid above the precipitate. Finally, we recorded our data.
In conclusion, after recording our data, we witnessed an increase in precipitation levels until test tube 5, where it proceeded to level out. We came to the conclusion that the KOH was a limiting reactant in the first 4 test tubes, as precipitation levels increased when the precipitate generally leveled out. The limiting reactant switched to CuSO4. The errors in our reaction that occurred were a transfer error in test tube 3 because precipitation levels were low, along with a measurement error in test tube 8 as the measurements and precipitations were off.
You killed it!
Ka-chow.